former Navi SEAL and his loyal dog were driving along a frozen lake when the dog suddenly started digging where no tracks should have been. Under the snow, they found a woman barely alive and her injured German shepherd still trying to protect her. He brought them to a remote cabin to save their lives, but what they carried was more dangerous than the storm. Before sunrise, a powerful man came smiling to the door, and by nightfall, the cabin went dark. What began as a rescue turned into a fight for truth, faith, and the kind of courage that refuses to stay buried. And when the ice started breaking, so did a secret that could tear an entire town apart. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subs so I can keep bringing you more stories like this. The morning after the storm, Cedar Hollow looked almost holy. Snow lay across the lake in one wide, unbroken sheet, bright as hammered silver under the winter sun. The sky had cleared overnight, but the cold had not. It came sharp and clean, cutting through cloth and breath and memory alike. Wind moved over the frozen shoreline in low whispers, lifting powder off the drifts and sending it skimming across the ice like pale smoke. Gideon Vale drove slowly along the rutted service trail above the lake in his old utility vehicle, one gloved hand on the wheel, the other resting near the radio he had not turned on. He was 37, tall, just over 6 feet, and built the way practical men are built in hard places. Lean, strong, economical, no bulk for show, no softness either. His face was clean-shaven, jaw square, cheekbones sharp under weather-roughened skin that had once been fair and now carried the permanent burn of northern wind. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, though a little longer than regulations once allowed. The cold moved it when he stepped outside. His eyes were a gray-blue that missed very little and forgave even less, least of all in himself. He wore the same clothes he wore most winter mornings, an old olive-gray tactical combat shirt softened by time, faded at the shoulders and wrists, combat pants in worn earth green with frayed knees, old military work boots scarred at the toes, and a battered field watch on his left wrist. Nothing new, nothing ornamental, everything earned. Beside him sat Rook. Rook was a 4-year-old German shepherd with a yellow-black coat thickened by northern winters, black saddle dark and clean over his back, amber-brown eyes, and the kind of stillness that made people think twice before speaking. He was not oversized, but he carried himself with the grounded confidence of a dog who knew exactly what his body could do. His ears were upright and alive to every sound. A plain brown leather collar circled his neck, scuffed from weather and work. He was the sort of dog who did not waste movement and did not bark unless he meant it. Gideon had been checking storm damage and drift buildup along the tree-line roads. Fallen branches, washed-out markers, places a hiker or ice fisher could get trapped if the weather turned again. Routine, useful, quiet, the kind of work that kept a man from thinking too much. Rook's head lifted before Gideon saw anything. Not a full alert. Not yet. Just a change. Gideon noticed the dog's ears angle forward, then his nose worked the air once. Hard, deliberate, uncertain. That last part mattered. Rook knew deer, fox, rabbit, moose, even old gasoline in the snowpack from summer boats hauled too close to the shore. This wasn't that. "What is it?" Gideon asked, already slowing. Rook leaned toward the passenger door, muscles gathering under his coat. Gideon brought the vehicle to a stop beside a shallow bend where wind had piled the snow into high rolling drifts between scrub pine and young fir. There were no visible tracks leading in. No blood, no flurry of wing marks, nothing obvious enough to explain the dog's fixation. Rook gave a low sound in his chest, more urgency than warning. Gideon opened the door. The cold hit hard. Rook jumped down and moved fast, not toward the shoreline where animals usually crossed, but into a wind-carved trough half hidden behind a stand of brush. He didn't cast in circles like a hunting dog on scent. He ran straight and stopped so abruptly snow sprayed around his paws. Then he started digging. Not pawing, digging. Snow flew backward in frantic white arcs. Gideon's pulse tightened. Rook! The dog didn't look back. That alone was wrong. Gideon grabbed the folding rescue shovel from the back, boots punching into crusted drifts as he followed. Up close, the trough was deeper than it looked from the road, a natural depression where wind had dumped and packed layer after layer. Rook had already opened a narrow hole nearly to his chest. He plunged his muzzle in, jerked back, then dug harder. Gideon dropped to one knee and drove the shovel into the snow. The first few scoops came easy, powder on top, then denser windpack beneath. Rook shifted aside just enough to give him room but kept pawing at the edge, whining now, high and tight. Gideon worked fast, breath burning his lungs. 10 seconds, 20, 30. The shovel struck something soft, then resisted. Fabric. He went to his hands. Snow tore at his bare fingers through torn glove seams as he cleared a shoulder, then a sleeve, then a human arm bent awkwardly under the weight. The glove on the hand was small. Female. Skin at the wrist was blanched where the sleeve had ridden up. Jesus. He cleared higher and found a face. A woman half buried on her side in the drift. Dark lashes crusted with frost, skin wax pale beneath windburn and cold. Her hair, brown, maybe chestnut, was matted with ice where it had come loose from a tie. She looked to be in her early 30s, lean-faced, fine-boned, with the kind of features that suggested endurance more than fragility. There were bruising shadows under her eyes, and a terrible stillness to her lips. Gideon leaned in, gloved fingers at her neck. Weak pulse, too slow. But there. "Stay with me," he muttered, though she was barely conscious. "Stay with me." Rook barked once, sharp, not at the woman but to the left. Gideon turned. Rook had already moved 3 feet away and was digging again. For one heartbeat, Gideon thought maybe another person. Then he saw fur beneath the snow, a dog's ear, dark at the edge, frosted. Gideon swore under his breath and scrambled over. Rook was almost frantic now. Snow caked across his muzzle. Together they opened the second pocket. A German shepherd female, smaller than Rook, yellow-black coat dulled by ice and powder, lay wedged against the woman's legs, body, curved as if she had tried to shield her. Her chest moved in thin, shallow pulls. One foreleg was pinned and twisted under packed snow, and her muzzle trembled with exhausted effort. "Easy, girl, easy!" The shepherd's eyes opened, brown, bright, and full of fury. She tried to lunge and managed only a strangled growl, the sound rough from cold and strain. Rook stepped between Gideon and the buried dog without aggression, standing at an angle, shoulders broad, head low, not claiming, not threatening, simply making space. A professional. Gideon had seen men do less with more training. He freed the dog's chest first, then the pinned leg enough for circulation, then returned to the woman. He moved by triage instinct and old muscle memory. Airway, breathing, exposure, heat loss, transport. He worked fast, but not carelessly. Fast got people out. Careless killed them on the way home. The woman stirred when he cut the packed snow away from her torso. Her lips moved. He leaned, closer, feeling the cold radiate off her like opened ice. Her voice came broken and small, words snagging on breath. "Don't let them find the blue." "What blue?" Gideon asked instantly. "What blue what?" Her eyes opened halfway. They were a pale, winter kind of blue. Not empty, just exhausted beyond language. They flicked past him toward the other dog, then toward the trees, and then she slipped under again before the sentence finished. Gideon felt the old anger rise, the useless one, the one at timing, weather, chance. He reached for the thermal blanket in his kit, wrapping her carefully while keeping movement controlled. Moderate hypothermia may be worse if he was unlucky. Dangerous, but survivable if he moved now and moved right. Rook had eased closer to the female shepherd. The other dog bared her teeth weakly and rumbled again, trying to protect her handler, even buried to the ribs and shaking. "That's right," Gideon said quietly as he worked. "You stay mean. Mean keeps you alive." He slid his arms under the woman and lifted. She was lighter than he expected, all hard angles and winter clothing soaked with cold. Behind him, Rook made a low sound Gideon knew well. Not alarm, but hurry. He looked up. The tree line stood silent in the bright snow. Nothing moved, and yet Rook was not watching the lake, not the road, not the woman. His stare was fixed deep into the pines, ears forward, body turned as if the danger had a direction, and he had already chosen it. For a moment, Gideon felt the strange pressure that comes when instinct arrives before proof. Not fear exactly, recognition. He carried the woman to the vehicle, laid her across the back seat over blankets, and returned for the other dog. The shepherd, Juniper, he would later learn, snapped weakly at his sleeve, then yelped when she tried to stand. Gideon checked the front leg with gentle, quick hands. Not cleanly broken, maybe a strain or bruise. He wrapped it for support and hauled her in with less grace than she deserved and more care than she trusted. Rook jumped in last, planting himself sideways between the back seat and the open door, body making a barrier between Gideon and the woman, while still keeping eyes on the woods. A watchdog's compromise. Gideon shut the door and rounded to the driver's side, breathing hard. His fingers ached. His jaw was set so tight it hurt. As he started the engine, the woman moaned once and turned her face toward the dog beside her. The female shepherd pressed forward despite pain and touched her nose to the woman's shoulder. Alive answering alive. Gideon pulled the vehicle onto the trail and headed for the cabin at Cedar Hollow, mind already running through heat protocols, dry clothing, call range, Doc Pike's number if the signal held. Practical steps, sequence, control what could be controlled. But the sentence stayed with him all the way down the ridge. Don't let them find the blue what? Blue bag? Blue file? Blue box? Blue truck? Or something worse, a name. Halfway to the turnoff, Rook rose suddenly and braced his front paws against the back seat, staring out through the frost at the rear window. No bark, no growl. Just that hard, locked focus that meant he had seen or heard something Gideon had not. Gideon checked the mirror. Only white road, wind-blown powder, pines. Then, in the back, Juniper did something that tightened the air inside the vehicle by another degree. She forced herself upright on trembling legs, leaned over the woman as if shielding her body, and let out a low, torn growl aimed not at Gideon, not at Rook, but toward the trees they had just left behind, as if whoever had buried them might still be standing there, watching the tire tracks disappear. By the time Gideon Vale turned off the service trail and took the narrow path down toward his cabin, the sun had shifted from white to pale gold, and the cold had sharpened again. Cedar Hollow looked gentler from a distance than it ever felt up close. The lake spread out behind the cabin like a sheet of frozen light, bright and calm and merciless beneath the sky. The little house itself sat back from the shore among pine and birch, built of old timber that had darkened with weather. It was not pretty in the polished postcard way. It was useful. A steep roof that shed snow, a deep porch that blocked wind, a cast-iron stove inside that could heat the whole place if you fed it enough wood and patience. Gideon killed the engine and moved fast. He opened the rear door first. The woman was still breathing, but her face had gone that dangerous, colorless gray that made every minute count. The female shepherd beside her, Juniper, lifted her head and let out a low warning, weaker now, more instinct than force. Her eyes were bright with pain and distrust. "Yeah," Gideon said quietly. "I'd hate me too." Rook jumped down and stood at Gideon's left, angled toward Juniper without crowding her. The dog's ears were up, posture tight but controlled, reading the room before there was even a room to read. Gideon had seen rookies act with less discipline. He carried the woman inside first. The warmth in the cabin was only relative. He'd banked the stove before leaving, and the fire was still alive under a layer of red coals. The air smelled of split pine, cold iron, old wool, and the faint, clean bite of soap. Gideon laid the woman on a thick blanket near the stove, not too close, never too fast with hypothermia, and stripped off his gloves with his teeth as he crossed to the shelf where he kept his medical kit. He had once learned trauma care in places where men bled into sand and dust. Northern cold had forced him to learn a different kind of urgency, slower hands, steadier choices, no heroics, no rushing heat into a body too cold to take it. He checked her pulse again. Better than on the road, but still weak. Her clothing was damp at the shoulders and sleeves. Her fingers were stiff enough that he had to move each one gently to check response. Juniper gave a raw bark from outside. Gideon looked toward the door. "Rook." Rook slipped out before the command fully landed. A few seconds later came the scrape and thump of two dogs negotiating space, pride, and pain on the porch. Gideon grabbed another blanket, a towel, and the old insulated pad he used for injured animals. He opened the door to find Rook standing one step below the threshold, still and watchful, while Juniper tried, furious, trembling, limping, to climb inside without accepting help from anyone. Up close, she was younger than he'd first guessed. 4, maybe. A German shepherd female with a yellow-black coat lighter than Rook's, a narrower frame, and a small white patch beneath her chin that showed when she lifted her head to growl. Her left foreleg was swelling around the wrist. Snow had clumped in the fur along her belly. She was exhausted, half frozen, and still trying to be a wall between danger and her person. "Stubborn," Gideon muttered. "Good." He crouched slowly, avoiding direct reach. Juniper bared her teeth and put her ears back. Rook looked at her, then at Gideon, then deliberately stepped aside and sat down. It was such a measured gesture that Gideon almost laughed. "Fine," he said. "You be the ambassador." Juniper finally crossed the threshold on her own, dragging the bad leg, and made straight for the woman on the floor. She collapsed beside her with a strained grunt and pressed her muzzle against the woman's sleeve. Only then did she stop watching Gideon. Gideon exhaled once, long and controlled, then reached for the radio handset clipped near the pantry wall. Static. He turned. The knob adjusted, tried again. The speaker crackled with a burst of broken sound. The woman on the blanket jerked hard. Her eyes flew open. For one startled second, she looked not confused but hunted, pupils wide, breath catching high in her chest, shoulders trying to recoil before her body had the strength to move. "No," she whispered, voice frayed. "Turn it off." The fear in her tone was immediate and specific, not generalized panic, not cold delirium, recognition. Gideon clicked the radio off at once. Silence rushed back into the cabin, thick as wool. The woman stared at him, breathing fast, one hand clenched in the blanket. She was in her early 30s, he thought, with chestnut brown hair now damp and tangled where ice had melted into it. A narrow face, and pale blue eyes sharpened by exhaustion instead of softened by it. She looked like someone used to enduring discomfort quietly, and like someone whose quiet had finally been broken by force. "You're safe," Gideon said, and hated how often men had said that in the world without earning it. "For now. You're in my cabin. Cedar Hollow. You were in bad shape." Her gaze slid past him to Juniper. Some part of her loosened. The dog answered with a small, breathy sound and tried to lick her wrist. The woman swallowed. "Junie." "Still mean," Gideon said. "That's working in her favor." The corner of the woman's mouth moved, not quite a smile. Good. He wanted answers, but he wanted her alive more. "I need to warm you gradually," he said. "Dry layers, warm fluids when you can keep them down. No sudden heat. Your dog's leg needs checking too." She nodded once, then winced at the motion. When he carefully cut away her outer gloves and loosened her jacket cuffs, he saw the marks more clearly. Bruised bands around both wrists, red-purple against chilled skin. Not from a fall. Restraints. There was also a short fragment of industrial zip tie caught in the seam near her cuff, and a gray powder embedded in the fabric at the elbow. Stone dust, fine and gritty, the kind common around blasting sites and shoreline construction work. He said nothing for a moment. Her eyes found his face anyway. She knew what he had seen. "I wasn't lost," she said, voice thin but steadying. "I was put there." The stove ticked and settled. A log shifted inside with a dry crack. Gideon looked at her for a long beat. "By who?" Her throat moved. She closed her eyes, then opened them again and looked away. "Not yet." It was not the answer he wanted, but it was not a lie either. He had learned the difference in places where both could get you killed. He stood and crossed to the sink, filled a pot, set it on the stove, then pulled his satellite-capable phone from the charging shelf and stepped near the window where reception sometimes reached, if the clouds were kind. One bar blinked in and out. He dialed anyway. Doc Harlan Pike answered on the fourth ring with no greeting, only a voice like sandpaper dragged over cedar. "If this is you, Gideon, and you're calling before noon, somebody's bleeding." "Not bleeding much," Gideon said. "Hypothermia, human female, shepherd with possible front leg injury. Need guidance and maybe a visit if roads are passable." A pause. Then, "Alive?" "Yes." "Conscious?" "In and out." "Good. Don't get brave with heat. Slow warming. Core first. Sweet liquids if she can swallow. Check confusion, shivering, skin color. Dog, support the leg, no forcing weight, keep her dry. I'll come if my truck can bully through the drifts." Doc Pike hung up, which was his version of reassurance. Harlan Pike was 70 if he was a day. Broad through the shoulders despite age, with a white beard he kept trimmed short and eyebrows that looked permanently skeptical. He had spent years as a veterinarian and some years before that as an Army Reserve medic, and the combination had made him practical to the point of bluntness. He disliked drama, distrusted officials in polished shoes, and once stitched Gideon's forearm by lamplight while arguing about fishing line. If he said he would come, he would come. Gideon returned to the stove and poured warm water into metal bottles wrapped in dish towels. He placed them near the woman's torso and hips, careful with distance. Juniper watched every move, growling under her breath when his hand came too close too quickly. "Easy," the woman whispered to the dog. Then to Gideon, "She's not aggressive, she's working." So is he. Gideon jerked his chin toward Rook. Rook sat near the doorway, not resting, not pacing, simply holding watch on the room with that unnerving patience of his. Every so often he looked at Gideon's hands, then at the woman, then back at Juniper, as if keeping account. The woman's breathing slowly steadied. Color came back in patches to her cheeks and ears. Gideon gave her a few spoonfuls of warm, lightly sweetened water. She kept them down. "What should I call you?" he asked after a while. She hesitated just long enough to matter. "Mara." He heard the hesitation and filed it away without comment. "Mara what?" Another pause. "Ellison." This time she said it more smoothly, and he trusted it less. Before he could ask anything else, she flinched sharply and grabbed at her sleeve. Juniper had begun pawing at the inside lining of Mara's coat, where it lay drying near the stove. Not randomly, but with insistent precision. Scratch. Pause. Scratch again. Then a low whine. Mara stared. "No," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Gideon watched the dog, then the coat. "What is she trying to show me?" Mara looked from the coat to Juniper, and something like dread passed across her face. Quick, private, unmistakable. "She thinks it's still there." "Thinks what's still there?" Mara swallowed hard. Her eyes stayed on the coat. "A capsule, waterproof, small." She pushed herself up on one elbow too fast. The room tilted under her, and she went pale again. Gideon was beside her in one stride, steadying without pinning. "Stay down. I need to check." Her voice had changed. Not fear this time. Urgency. He brought the coat over and laid it across the blanket. Juniper, trembling from cold and effort, lifted her muzzle and nosed a seam along the inner lining near the rib area, then scratched once more. Rook stood up and came closer, silent, curious now. Gideon found the stitching line. It had been opened and re-sewn by hand, cleanly but in a hurry if you knew where to look. He took out his folding knife and glanced at Mara. She nodded. "Do it." He slid the blade under the loose thread and opened the seam. A narrow metal tube dropped into his palm. It was no longer than his hand, dull silver, sealed, the kind of thing built to survive water, impact, and bad intentions. Mara exhaled so suddenly it was almost a sob. Then she reached for it, and her fingers stopped an inch away. Something in Gideon's expression must have warned her. He turned the tube once in his hand and held it near the stove light. The cap had already been opened, not by him. The seal ring was broken, edges scarred. He unscrewed it carefully and tipped it into his palm. Nothing came out. Empty. For the first time since waking, Mara looked truly shaken. Not from cold, not from pain, but from the kind of loss that rearranged the room around a person. "No," she said again, barely audible. "No, no." Juniper pressed herself against Mara's side and whined, eyes fixed on the empty tube as if she, too, understood absence. Rook did not move closer. He simply watched Gideon's hand, then Mara's face, then the torn seam in the coat. The stove cracked softly behind them. Outside, wind moved over the lake and brushed the walls like a hand searching for a way in. Gideon closed his fingers around the empty capsule and felt the shape of a problem he did not yet understand. Whatever had been inside it mattered enough to bury a woman in the snow, and someone had gotten to it first. Morning came slowly to Cedar Hollow. Not because the sun was late, but because the cabin had become a place where time moved around wounds. Gideon Vale woke in the chair by the stove with his neck stiff, one boot half unlaced, and Rook already awake. The dog stood near the front window, ears forward, head slightly lowered, watching the pale strip of road beyond the trees. His yellow-black coat caught the stove light in dark bronze and shadow. He did not bark. He rarely did. But the stillness in him had changed. It was the kind Gideon associated with listening before trouble had a shape. On the blanket by the stove, the woman who called herself Mara was awake too. Color had returned to her face overnight, though it came and went in uneven patches. Her chestnut hair had dried into loose, untidy waves around her shoulders. In the hard winter light, her pale blue eyes looked clearer and more guarded than they had the night before. She held herself carefully, like someone cataloging every ache before deciding what to show. Juniper lay pressed against her side, one foreleg wrapped, chin on Mara's hip, watching Gideon with a protective, exhausted vigilance. The cabin smelled of coffee grounds, damp wool, pine smoke, and dog. "You should still be sleeping," Gideon said, standing and rolling his shoulders. Mara glanced toward the window. "You should too." Didn't ask. A faint breath of a smile touched her mouth and disappeared. "You ask like a man who expects lies." Gideon poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove. "I was trained by experience." He didn't say war. He didn't have to. Mara watched him for a moment, then looked down at Juniper and ran her fingers through the dog's neck fur in slow, absent strokes. Juniper relaxed under the touch by degrees, but never fully. Her eyes kept moving. Door, window, Gideon, Rook, back to Mara. A working dog recovering from cold and fear and still trying to do her job. Gideon handed Mara a mug of warm tea sweetened more than he liked, and sat across from her. He let the silence hold for a while. People talked more honestly when they didn't feel chased. When he finally spoke, his voice was neutral. "What you told me yesterday was true, but not complete." Mara stared into the cup. "That sounds like something a report would say before it got someone fired. That happened to you often?" This time the smile didn't come. She looked up. "More than once." Gideon leaned forward, forearms on his knees. "I'm not asking for everything, just enough to know what I brought into my house." Mara held his gaze. She was tired, bruised, and visibly still weak, but there was nothing fragile in the way she looked at him. "My name is not Mara Ellison." Rook turned his head at the shift in her tone. Juniper lifted her muzzle and watched Gideon's face. Gideon waited. "Mara is what I use when I need people to forget I've been somewhere," she said. "Ellison is from an old field badge. It was fast. It worked until now. What should I call you?" A pause. "Mara is fine." He almost pushed, didn't. "Job?" he asked instead. She drew a breath, bracing against more than pain. "Environmental field analysis, independent contract work, illegal dumping, runoff contamination, places where money gets buried and people call it development." Gideon's jaw tightened just slightly. He knew enough of the region to know what that meant. Shoreline construction, quiet contracts, permits signed at the right dinner table, fish kills explained away with weather. "And Juniper?" Mara glanced down at the dog, some warmth returning to her expression. Certified scent-trained support for field survey work. Soil anomalies. Accelerants sometimes. Chemical signatures when equipment says one thing and the ground says another. Juniper thumped her tail once against the blanket, as if acknowledging the introduction. Gideon nodded slowly. It fit the dog's behavior. The precision, the fixation on certain smells, the way she watched objects, not just people. It also made the rest of the story worse. Before he could ask another question, his phone buzzed on the counter. One bar, then none, then one again. He crossed the room and caught the call before the signal vanished. Vale. Deputy Nolan Pierce. The voice was young but trying hard not to sound it. You home? Gideon looked toward the window, then at Rook. The dog's posture sharpened at the edge of the call, sensing change in Gideon before hearing anything else. Depends who's asking, Gideon said. A quick exhale at the other end, half annoyed, half relieved. Still charming then. I'm at the station. Had a guy come through this morning asking about your road. Said he was looking for a place to ice fish, but he named the wrong side of the lake and didn't have gear in the truck. What truck? Dark green pickup, mud on the wheel wells even in this cold. Temporary plate frame but no temp tag. Mid-40s male, stocky, shaved head, reddish beard that looked trimmed with a hunting knife. Smile too ready. Nolan lowered his voice. He asked if the old SEAL still lives alone. Gideon's face went still. Deputy Nolan Pierce was 29, lean and long-limbed. With sandy hair he kept too neat for small-town policing, and a face that looked younger until he stopped smiling. He'd grown up in Cedar County, left for 2 years, and come back after his father's stroke to help his mother keep the hardware store. He wore the badge like a man still deciding whether institutions deserved his loyalty. Gideon liked him for that. Did you answer? Gideon asked. No. Told him roads near your place were drifted shut. Nolan hesitated, which was a lie yesterday. Not sure about today. Good lie. Thought you'd say that. Another pause. You in something, Gideon? Gideon looked at Mara. She had gone very still, listening without seeming to. Juniper's ears were up. Rook was now standing between Gideon and the front door, body angled toward the porch. I'm in weather, Gideon said, and I may need a favor. Name it. Quietly ask Elsie Rowe if she's seen that truck near the North Service Road or Quarry Spur. Don't use my name. Nolan gave a short laugh. Elsie's probably already got the plate and tire brand. She usually does. I'll call back if I learn anything. And Gideon, yeah? If this is trouble, don't wait too long to let me be useful. The line crackled and died. Gideon lowered the phone and stood a moment with it in his hand. Mara set her cup down. You have local law enforcement. I have one deputy I trust to ask questions before he talks. That's more than most people get. Gideon turned to her. Why would someone ask if I live alone? Her expression closed, then opened just enough to be honest. Because they don't know who found me. If they did, they'd ask different questions. Like what? Like whether your dog bites on command. Rook looked at her, then at Gideon, and settled back on his haunches as if the answer should have been obvious. Gideon almost smiled. Almost. A while later, as the morning stretched and the stove burned steady, Mara dozed again. Juniper slept in short, alert bursts, waking whenever Gideon crossed the room. Doc Pike arrived near noon in a truck older than the county and louder than a chainsaw. The engine announced him before the knock did. Harlan Pike came through the door carrying a weathered vet bag and enough cold air with him to make the stove work harder. He was a broad man, gone thick with age rather than fat, with a trimmed white beard, red-rimmed eyes from winter wind, and hands like split oak. He wore an old canvas coat, wool, cap, and the expression of a man personally offended by preventable injury. He looked from Gideon to Mara to Juniper and grunted. "Well, you've been busy." "Morning to you too," Gideon said. Doc Pike knelt by Juniper first. Female shepherd, 4-ish, underconditioned from stress, not neglect. Good coat, smart eyes, mean enough to live. He held out a hand and let Juniper smell him before touching her. "That'll do, girl." He examined the wrapped foreleg, joints, paw pads, ribs, pupils, gums. Juniper endured with restrained outrage and one low complaint when he flexed the wrist. Sprain, bad bruising, no obvious break. Rest, compression, keep her warm, keep her from doing heroic nonsense. Pike looked over his shoulder at Gideon. So naturally, she'll ignore all of that. "Runs in the house," Gideon said. Doc Pike snorted and moved to Mara. He checked her pulse, temperature, nails, and mental clarity with brisk competence. "You're lucky," he told her without softness and without cruelty. "And luck is not a treatment plan. You rest today. Tomorrow too, if your body has any sense." His gaze sharpened. "Any head injury? Gaps in time?" Mara answered carefully. "Some memory is spotty around the attack. I remember enough." That's often the dangerous amount. He packed away his stethoscope and stood, joints popping. "Call if her shivering stops and she gets sleepy in the wrong way. Call if the dog's breathing changes. Call if either of them tries to prove they're fine." Before he left, Pike gave Gideon a look that asked 10 questions and voiced none. Gideon saw the respect in that and was grateful for it. After the truck noise faded, the cabin felt too quiet. Around mid-afternoon, while Gideon chopped wood just off the porch and Rook watched the tree line, his phone buzzed again. Nolan this time, but he wasn't the only one on the call. "I've got Elsie here," Nolan said. "She insisted." A woman's voice cut in before Gideon could reply. "Because he'd forget details if I didn't. Gideon, it's Elsie." Elsie Rowe was 62 and built like a fence post that had survived several storms on principle. She owned the bait and tackle shop near the gas station and saw more of Cedar Hollow's traffic than the sheriff did. Her skin was weathered walnut brown from years on docks and in wind, her gray hair braided down her back, and her eyes quick and unsentimental as a bookkeeper's. She remembered plates, faces, and lies with equal accuracy. "You still writing things down on bait receipts?" Gideon asked. "Carbon paper now. I'm modern." He could hear her chewing something. Peppermint, probably. "Green pickup came through after dark, 2 nights running. Not from here. Slow along the north spur, no fishing gear, no auger, no trailer. Last night, another truck met him near the old wash road for 10 minutes with lights off." Gideon set the chakya axe down. "Did you get the plate?" "Partial. Enough to start if Nolan can be sneaky for once." A pause. "You got company up there, Gideon?" He let silence answer a beat too long. Elsie clicked her tongue softly. "That's what I thought. Tell your dog he was right." Gideon frowned. "What?" "I stopped by your place 3 days ago with venison stew. Your shepherd met me at the truck and wouldn't let me walk to the porch. Not aggressive. Just blocked me and kept looking at the road behind me like he expected someone else to follow." Her voice lowered. "I've seen dogs do that before storms and before funerals. Different reasons. Same face." For a moment, Gideon stared at the stacked wood and felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with weather. Rook, 20 feet away, lifted his head and looked straight at him. Not because he heard Elsie, because he heard the silence afterward. "Thanks, Elsie," Gideon said quietly. "Nah, don't thank me yet. Just don't be alone in your own mind too long. Men like you get stupid there." The line ended. Gideon stood still, one hand on the axe handle, while the wind shifted over the lake. It was an ordinary winter sound, a dry hush over snow. But for one strange second, he remembered another voice from years ago, a woman in a different country, laughing at him for checking exits before sitting down. "You treat peace like an ambush," she had said. He closed his eyes once, then opened them and carried the wood inside. Mara was awake, sitting upright now with a blanket around her shoulders. On the table beside her sat an old framed photograph Gideon had not touched in years. In it, Gideon looked younger, thinner in the face, standing on a dock beside a man in a wool coat and expensive boots, both of them squinting into wind. Calder Rowan. Mara's face had gone pale in a way the cold no longer explained. "Where did you get that?" she asked. "Drawer stuck. Open." Gideon set the wood down slowly. "Why?" Mara pointed at the photo, not at Calder's face, but at his right hand resting on the dock rail. A heavy silver ring caught the light in the picture, thick band, engraved anchor motif. Juniper rose with a strained effort, limped to the table and stared at the photo. Her lip curled. A low growl rolled out of her chest, startling in its certainty. Rook came to stand beside Gideon, ears forward, gaze fixed not on the dog, but on Mara. Gideon felt the room narrow. "Talk," he said. Mara's eyes stayed on the ring. "I've smelled the same solvent blend on equipment at 2 illegal dump sites, industrial degreaser and marine fuel residue. The man who grabbed me wore gloves, but when he leaned in..." She swallowed. Juniper reacted the same way then. Same scent family, same metal polish underneath. Gideon looked at the photo, then at the dog, then back at Mara. "Calder Rowan funds half the shoreline projects in this county." Mara met his eyes. "Then he also knows where the ground gets quiet." No one spoke for several seconds. Then Rook moved. He crossed to the front door without a sound and stood rigid, nose lifted, body aligned with the seam where wood met cold air. A beat later came a soft thump from the porch. Not a knock. Something set down carefully. Gideon drew the pistol from the lockbox shelf in one practiced motion and moved to the wall beside the door. Rook stayed low and ready. Juniper planted herself in front of Mara despite the bad leg, trembling but determined. Gideon waited, counted, no footsteps leaving, no engine starting, only wind. He opened the door fast. The porch was empty. On the top step sat a brown paper bag, folded once at the top, dry despite the snow. Gideon kept the pistol low and used his boot to nudge it open. Inside was a single unspent bullet and a handwritten note on torn paper. 3 words, block letters pressed hard enough to scar the page. The first rule Gideon Vale had learned about fear was simple. Fear loved empty space. It grew in silence, in long waits, in the gap between a sound and its meaning. By sunrise, the paper bag on the porch was gone, burned in the stove after he copied the handwriting in a notebook. But the feeling it left behind still moved through the cabin like cold draft under a door. So he gave everyone something to do. Mara sat at the table wrapped in a wool blanket, Juniper at her feet, while Gideon spread a county map across the wood and pinned the corners down with mugs. The map was old enough to show logging routes that no longer existed, and new enough to include private access roads near the lake. Rook lay beside Gideon's chair, chin on his paws. eyes open. Mara looked better than she had the day before, but only if a person didn't know what to look for. Her color had returned, yet her hands still trembled when she reached too quickly. There was a thin delay between questions and answers, as if her mind had to step around one memory to reach another. She wore one of Gideon's heavy flannel overshirts over her thermal layer. The sleeves were too long, and she kept pushing them back absently while she thought. "Start with what's certain," Gideon said. Mara nodded and pointed at the north side of the lake. 2 confirmed sampling sites with contamination signatures, one near the old wash road, one near a runoff cut that should not exist if the permits are accurate. "Should not exist," Gideon repeated, meaning someone moved earth without reporting it. She looked up, pale blue eyes steady despite the fatigue. "And someone with access to heavy equipment covered the tracks before inspectors came." Gideon tapped a spot near the quarry spur. "This where they grabbed you?" Her jaw tightened. "Near it. I was following a drainage line. Juniper hit on a chemical note that didn't match any natural pattern. I called it in." "To who?" Mara's fingers stilled on the map. A beat passed. "Not yet," she said quietly. Gideon let the silence sit, not because he liked it, but because pushing hard too soon often turned truth into defense. A truck engine sounded outside, loud and uneven. Doc Pike's. Harlan Pike came in carrying morning air, a metal thermos, and his old leather bag. The elderly veterinarian looked as if he had been carved from barnwood and then taught medicine out of spite. He was broad-shouldered, even in his 70s, beard white and clipped short, with a weathered face and skeptical eyes that had seen enough panic to dislike it on sight. "I brought broth," he said, setting the thermos on the counter. "For the woman, and strict instructions for everyone else to stop pretending coffee is a food group." "That's hurtful," Gideon said. "That's accurate." Pike crossed to Juniper and crouched with a grunt. "How's the leg, girl?" Juniper huffed once and gave him her paw with offended dignity. "Good," Pike murmured, gently checking the swelling. "Still ugly. Less dangerous." He glanced up at Mara. "How's the headache?" "Dull. Worse when I stand too fast." "You're healing then." "Healing is rude. It takes what time it wants." He checked Mara's pupils, pulse, and temperature again, then peered at the bruises on her wrists with the quiet anger of a man who had no patience for cruelty. He did not ask what happened. Not because he didn't care, because he knew she would talk sooner if she wasn't cornered. At the table, Gideon slid the map toward him. "Need a local opinion." Pike scanned the marked points and sucked his teeth. "Wash Road, North Spur, Old Culvert Line." He looked at Mara, then at Gideon. "This isn't some boys dumping paint cans." "No." Pike stood slowly, joints popping. "Then you need more than a vet and 1 deputy." "Working on it." Pike's gaze moved to Rook, then Juniper. "Dogs are already working on it better than the rest of you." He pulled a folded receipt from his coat pocket. "Elsie sent this over. Said you'd know what to do with it." Gideon unfolded it. License numbers, partials, times, arrows, and notes written in bold, slanted handwriting. Elsie Rowe documented vehicles the way other people documented storms, because pretending not to see them didn't make them less real. 3 trucks, Gideon said. Different nights. 4, Pike corrected. One's repeated. She circled it twice. Says same mud pattern, same cracked taillight edge. Mara leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Can I see?" Gideon handed her the paper. Juniper rose enough to rest her chin on Mara's knee, watching the page as if she could read it too. Mara studied the notes, then pointed to a line. This time here, 11:47. That's not random movement. Why not? Gideon asked. Because that's when the temperature drops enough for surface ice to harden over fresh tracks near the runoff trench. If you're moving something heavy and don't want it seen the next morning, that's the window. Doc Pike gave a low whistle. You keep company with cheerful people, Gideon. Only lately. Pike snorted, repacked his bag, and headed for the door. Before he left, he stopped with one hand on the frame and looked back at Mara. Whoever did this to you counted on cold finishing the job, he said. That kind of person usually counts wrong eventually. Don't help them by rushing your body. His eyes shifted to Gideon. And don't take her back out there unless the dogs say you should. Gideon lifted an eyebrow. That your medical advice? It's my northern advice. Costs extra. When he left, the cabin grew quiet again, but not empty. Quiet with purpose this time. By noon, Gideon had made his decision. He was going back to the site, not to search everything. Not yet. Just to confirm what could be confirmed before weather or people erased it. He told Mara she was staying. She told him no. Juniper tried to stand and nearly proved Gideon's point for him. You're not walking that terrain today, he said to Mara. I can guide from the truck. You can pass out in the truck. Mara met him with a look that might have cut younger men. I've worked in sleet with a fractured rib. And today you can recover in a chair. Gideon grabbed his coat. You want to help? Mark every route on that map Elsie logged. Times, direction, repeat vehicles, build me patterns. Mara held his stare another second, then looked away first. Not surrender, calculation. Take Juniper, she said. No. She knows the scent break near the water. She also can't put weight on her leg. Juniper, hearing her name and sensing disagreement, gave a low sound and limped toward the door anyway. Rook stood and, time all morning, Mara laughed. Small and time all morning, Mara laughed. Small and surprised and almost embarrassed by itself. The sound changed the room. Fine, she said, settling back into the chair. Go then. But if you bring back the wrong dirt sample, I'll insult your intelligence for a week. Make it 2, Gideon said, and left before the warmth of her laugh could do something inconvenient to his judgment. The trail to the recovery site looked different in daylight. Less dramatic. More dangerous. Snow had crusted over in places, sagged in others. The wind trough where he had found Mara and Juniper was partly drifted in again, as if the land itself had already begun covering its own witness marks. Gideon parked uphill and approached on foot with Rook ranging close, nose low, ears moving. Easy, Gideon murmured. We're reading, not chasing. Rook circled once, then pulled toward the edge of the depression. Gideon found the disturbed snow and the compressed shapes where bodies had lain. A few feet beyond, near a stand of young pines, he spotted what he'd hoped and hated to find, a shredded strip of industrial tarp trapped beneath ice crust. He knelt and worked it free. Gray-blue material, reinforced. Along one torn edge, a faded printed mark, half a contractor logo, maybe a stylized ridgeline or wave. Not enough to identify, but enough to narrow. Rook sneezed once, then moved off toward the road shoulder and pawed at a patch near a buried branch. Gideon dug and uncovered a broken zip tie head, thick and commercial grade. Same type as the fragment in Mara's sleeve. He bagged both pieces. The sky had gone flat with thin cloud when Rook suddenly froze, not alerting toward the trees this time, toward the lake. Gideon followed the dog's line and saw nothing at first, but snow, glare. Then he noticed a dark shape far out near the north edge, too small for a truck, too still for an animal. A cross. Weathered wood, half buried, leaning out of the snow near the old shoreline before the water level changed years back. Gideon knew there had once been a fishing shack there. He hadn't known anyone had died. Rook walked to the edge of the bank and sat facing the distant cross, posture oddly composed. No whining, no growl, just stillness. Gideon stood beside him in the wind, and without warning, remembered Layla's brother in Syria asking if there was a place to mourn without choosing sides. Gideon had not known how to answer then. He didn't know why the memory came now, except that grief and cold had a way of finding the same doors. Rook looked up at him once, then back at the frozen lake. For a moment, the world felt less like a hunt and more like a witness. Gideon shook it off, breathed out, and checked his watch. Enough reflection. Back to work. Hichatikenu followed Rook downslope toward the runoff cut Mara had marked. The terrain changed near the waterline. Snow thinned over patches of wind-polished ice and brush. Rook's gait changed too, more focused now, nose working in short, sharp pulls. At the edge of a narrow creek mouth where winter had half-sealed moving water under white crust, Rook stopped and sniffed at a low bank of drifted snow. He pawed once, then stepped back. Gideon crouched. There was a smell beneath the clean cold, faint but wrong. Chemical sweetness layered over fuel, and under that the sharp, sterile note of industrial deodorizer, a manufactured attempt at absence. Mara was right, he muttered. He marked the spot and moved slowly along the bank. 10 feet later, he found tire scarring beneath thin snow, partially frozen in place. Heavy tread, repeated passes. Somebody had backed close to water here. His phone buzzed weakly in his pocket. Nolan. Gideon answered with gloved fingers. Talk. Ran. Elsie's plate partials through what I could. Nolan said, voice hushed. One comes back to a subcontractor leased under Rowan Coastal Storage. Another's unregistered in the system, paper trail gap. That's not normal. Gideon looked at the waterline. No, it isn't. Nolan hesitated. I also asked around quietly. Calder Rowan's people have been buying access easements near old service roads. Cash offers, fast closes. For development? That's what they say. Nolan lowered his voice further. Gideon, if this touches Rowan, there'll be pressure from 3 directions before sunset. Then don't say his name yet. A pause. You already did, so now I'm worried. Join the club. When the call ended, Gideon stood listening to wind and hidden water under ice. Rook had moved 20 yards downstream and was digging at the bank where snow had drifted hard against a shelf of frozen mud. Gideon reached him just as the dog struck. Metal, a dull, hollow sound under packed ice. Rook dug faster, snow spraying over his shoulders. Gideon dropped to one knee and used the shovel, cutting through crust, levering chunks aside. Blue paint appeared first. Scraped, industrial, not bright, the kind used on utility storage. Then a corner, then a handle, not a body, a metal box, weather-sealed, heavy, blue. Gideon stopped moving for a heartbeat, pulse loud in his ears. Behind him, the creek whispered under ice, and ahead of him, Rook stood over the buried container, chest heaving, amber eyes fixed on Gideon as if to say, well? Gideon brushed more snow aside, exposing enough to see the lid and one bent latch. He did not open it. Not there. Not yet. He rested one hand on the cold metal and looked out across the white lake toward the cabin hidden behind trees and the woman waiting there with a name she didn't trust him enough to give. Then he looked at Rook. "So that's what they were digging for," he said. Rook blinked once, snow dust on his muzzle, and stayed where he was, guarding the blue box as if he had known all along that the ground was holding more than cold. Gideon Vale did not bring the blue box into the cabin until he had checked the tree line twice, the porch once, and the road bend with binoculars from the upstairs window. By the time he set it on the workbench near the mudroom, dusk had already lowered itself over Cedar Hollow. Winter light faded fast in the north. 1 minute the lake was silver, the next it was lead. Mara was waiting at the table with the county map, Elsie's receipt notes, and a legal pad covered in tight handwriting. Her face had more color than it had 2 days ago, but fatigue still sat behind her eyes like a second shadow. She moved carefully when she stood, and she still braced one hand on the table before taking a full step. Juniper lay beside her chair, wrapped in a folded quilt, forelegs splinted and rebandaged, ears twitching at every shift in the room. Rook entered first, snow dusting his muzzle and chest, then stepped aside only after Gideon came in with the box. Mara stared at the metal container as if it were a memory she had been trying not to name. "It's the right size," she said softly. "The right color." Gideon set it down without opening it. "And the right place." He took off his gloves, flexed his stiff fingers, and looked at her. "Before this gets opened, we do it clean. Notes, photos, time, witness." Mara blinked, then gave one tired nod. "Chain of custody. You said the magic words." He used his phone to photograph the box from all angles, including the bent latch, the scrape marks in the paint, the frost line along the bottom edge. He read the time aloud. Mara wrote it down with shaking fingers that steadied once she had a task. Gideon noticed that. He noticed too much. It was one of the reasons he slept badly. He called Nolan and got a weak connection on the second try. Deputy Nolan Pierce answered in a whisper. "Tell me this is good news. I found something buried at the creek mouth near the north runoff cut. Blue metal box, industrial storage type, possible evidence?" There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "You open it?" "Not yet." "Good." Nolan's voice dropped lower. "I'm logging this call off book until I know who's listening. I can come up. No uniforms, no lights, and if you come alone." A pause. That sentence is how every bad idea starts. "Then bring a better one." Nolan exhaled, almost a laugh. 45 minutes if the road doesn't drift over. Keep your doors locked." When Gideon hung up, Mara was still looking at the box. "You trust him?" she asked. "Enough to let him make his own mistakes." "That sounds almost kind." "Don't get used to it." The box was colder than the room and heavier than it looked. Gideon used a heat gun only at a distance to thaw ice from the latch without damaging whatever was inside. The metal sweated, then clicked as the bent latch loosened under a flat screwdriver and patient pressure. Juniper pushed herself upright with a low whine. Rook moved to stand beside Gideon's left knee, silent, watchful. Mara did not come closer. She gripped the edge of the table and stayed where she was, as if crossing the room might force the truth to arrive faster than she could bear it. Gideon lifted the lid. Inside, under a layer of plastic sheeting and damp foam, were 3 objects: a compact hard drive sealed in a weather sleeve, a paper ledger wrapped in waxed canvas, and a small sample jar filled with gray-brown sludge. The smell hit first when he peeled back the canvas. Fuel, solvent, something metallic and sour beneath it. Mara closed her eyes. "The ledger," she said. "That's what they were scared of." Gideon looked at her sharply. "You knew." I suspected. She swallowed. Data can be erased. Reports can be challenged. But handwritten logs with signatures, dates, transfer codes. Her voice thinned. That's harder to make disappear in court. He turned the first page of the ledger with gloved fingers. Columns, dates, load numbers, site abbreviations, initials, payment amounts. Some entries were clean and deliberate. Others rushed, like someone writing in bad light or a hurry. A few names were blacked out with marker, but not thoroughly enough. Mara stared at one line and went pale. What? Gideon asked. Her lips parted, closed, opened again. I told you I reported the contamination. You did. I reported it to the right office. She looked at the ledger, not at him. And that was the mistake. Gideon waited. Mara's voice dropped to almost nothing. Because the person I reported it to was already being paid. A hard knock sounded on the front door. All three humans froze. Rook and Juniper reacted first. Rook did not bark. He moved, fast, quiet, direct, to the front of the room and angled his body between the door and Gideon. Juniper surged halfway up, pain flashing through her body, and planted herself in front of Mara with a raw growl that rattled in her chest. Another knock, heavier this time. Then Nolan's voice, low through the wood. Pierce, alone, freezing. Gideon exhaled once and went to the door with his pistol low but ready. He checked through the side window before opening. Deputy Nolan Pierce stepped in with snow on his shoulders and caution in his eyes. He was lean and tall in a sheriff's winter jacket, sandy hair damp from melted frost, clean-shaven with a face that still looked boyish until he saw something that mattered. Tonight, it mattered. He scanned the room, the dogs, the box on the bench, and the way Mara held herself. No offense, Nolan said, but you all look like the middle of a federal hearing. Give it time, Gideon said. Nolan removed his gloves and approached the bench. He had the posture of a man trying to remain professional while realizing the floor beneath his town was more rotten than he thought. Gideon showed him the ledger and sample jar first, then the drive. Nolan's jaw tightened when he saw the company abbreviations. RCS Rowan Coastal Storage. Mara nodded once. A logistics front, maybe not the only one. Maybe? Nolan echoed. Mara met his eyes. If this network is what I think it is, Rowan's not the top. He's the local hinge. Nolan looked at Gideon. You hear that a lot from people in trouble? Only from the smart ones. Nolan photographed the items, logged the time, and scribbled notes in a small black pocket notebook. I can't move this through local evidence without half the county hearing about it before midnight, he said. If Rowan's tied in, we need federal environmental enforcement. Quietly. Gideon nodded toward Mara. She has a contact? Mara hesitated, then shook her head. Had. I don't know who's clean anymore. The lights went out. The stove glow remained, but the cabin dropped into a thick, immediate dark beyond its circle of orange. Nolan swore softly. Storm? No wind on the lines, Gideon said. Rook's head snapped toward the back of the house. At the same instant, Juniper let out a sharp, furious bark toward the mudroom door. Gideon was moving before the sound had finished. Lantern, he said to Nolan. No flashlights in windows. Nolan grabbed one from the shelf and thumbed it on low, shielding the glass with his palm. Mara had already pulled the ledger and drive toward her, instinct overriding weakness. Gideon pointed to the narrow door beside the pantry. Wood cellar. Now. Mara stared at him. I can help. You can survive? Move. Juniper limped with her, one shoulder brushing Mara's leg as if to hold her upright. Rook stayed with Gideon. The first impact hit the back door hard enough to shake the frame. Not testing. Committed. Nolan drew his service weapon and took position behind the kitchen wall, breathing through his nose, face gone pale but steady. Gideon killed the lantern nearest the window and listened. A second blow. Metal against wood. Crowbar? Nolan whispered. Or Halligan, Gideon said. The power cut had not been random. Someone had dropped the line or killed the exterior feed and come in under dark. Fast. Confident. They thought they were raiding a cabin with one injured woman and maybe an old dog. They did not know the old dog. The lock splintered. The door drove inward, and freezing black air poured through the opening with two figures behind it. Heavy jackets, balaclavas, gloves, boots wrapped in tape to muffle tread. The first carried a pry bar. The second moved lower and faster, heading straight for the mudroom bench where the blue box had been. Rook launched without a sound. He hit the second man high in the thigh and hip, driving him sideways into the wall before the man even saw him. The intruder crashed hard, swore, and swung with his forearm. Rook released and re-engaged instantly, not mauling, controlling space and movement the way Gideon had trained him. Pressure, retreat half-step, pressure again. Nolan shouted, "Sheriff's office, down!" The man with the pry bar turned toward the voice and raised the tool. Gideon closed the distance in 2 strides, caught the man's wrist with both hands, and drove him into the doorframe. The pry bar slammed the wood and fell. The intruder twisted with surprising skill, not local drunk strength, but practiced, coordinated resistance. Gideon felt it immediately and adjusted. Hip pressure, elbow lock, knee to balance, all quick and ugly in the dark. A crash sounded from the hall, Morara. Juniper's bark changed, pain, anger, and warning all at once. Gideon looked in time to see a third shape at the side window, glass broken in a spiderweb burst, one arm reaching through toward the hallway latch. Juniper hit the reaching arm at mid-forearm and clamped down despite the splinted leg, growling with a ferocity that seemed bigger than her body. The intruder screamed and tried to yank free, dragging the dog halfway onto the sill. Mara grabbed Juniper's collar and pulled with both hands, face white with effort. "Junie, hold!" That single word carried training and love in equal measure. Juniper held. Rook, hearing the scream, broke from his target and pivoted toward the hall. The man he had hit first stumbled up, and Gideon caught a glimpse of skin where the balaclava shifted at the neck. Ink. A dark, blocky tattoo above the collar line. Not clear enough to read, but enough to mark. Nolan fired one round into the ceiling. The blast stunned the room into one impossible second of silence. "Out!" Nolan roared, voice cracking and strong at once. "Now!" It worked. The man at the window ripped his arm free with a curse and left fabric in Juniper's teeth. The first intruder shoved off the wall and bolted through the broken back doorway. The third, half pinned under Rook's pressure moments before, limped after him. Snow and darkness swallowed them. Gideon did not pursue. Too many unknowns. Too much to protect. He stood in the ruined back door with pistol up, listening to the retreating crunch of boots, and then, farther off, an engine grinding to life where no vehicle should have been parked if they meant a quiet approach. Rook came to his side, chest heaving, no blood on his muzzle. "Good," Gideon said, one hand touching the dog's shoulder for half a second. "Good boy." Behind him, Juniper released a torn sleeve and staggered. Mara caught her before she fell, breath shaking, eyes bright with something close to panic and fury mixed together. Nolan moved to the broken window, checked the dark, then turned back, face flushed and stunned. "3 of them," he said. "3, in a storm-dark cut with no lights." "Not storm-dark," Gideon said. He looked toward the dead kitchen fixture. "Tutti planned dark." Mara sat down hard on the floor beside Juniper, one hand pressed to the dog's ribs, the other wrapped around the waxed canvas ledger she had somehow kept hold of the entire time. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Gideon crouched in front of her. "You were saying something before Nolan knocked." Mara looked at the ledger, then at him. Her voice came rough, scraped clean by adrenaline. "They don't fear the contamination report," she said. "They fear the signatures." Gideon frowned. "Whose signatures?" "Payment authorizations, transfer approvals, people who never touch the sites but profit from them." Her eyes lifted, hollow and fierce. "This is not about dumping anymore. It's about who got paid to pretend it wasn't happening." Nolan stared at the ledger in her hands. "That's conspiracy." Mara gave a humorless smile. "That's a start." The night wore on in broken pieces. Nolan radioed in a false utility issue to explain his shot and buy time without naming the cabin. Gideon boarded the broken window with scrap planks from the shed, while Mara sat wrapped in blankets, Juniper against her, and copied key names and numbers from the ledger in case they lost the original. Rook paced the perimeter inside the house once every few minutes, pausing at doors, at the stairs, at the mudroom, then returning to Gideon like a metronome built from instinct. Close to dawn, after the stove had been fed twice, and everyone's nerves had settled into that exhausted clarity that comes after violence, headlights appeared on the road. Slow, deliberate, not sneaking. A clean black SUV stopped at the edge of the drive. The man who stepped out looked expensive even under winter gear. Calder Rowan was in his mid-50s, broad in the chest, silver-brown hair combed back neatly beneath a dark wool cap, beard trimmed close along a strong jaw gone softer with age and comfort. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a cream turtleneck, dark trousers, polished boots not meant for this kind of snow, and leather gloves that matched the interior of moneyed vehicles. In daylight, he often looked like a civic benefactor in a brochure. Calm eyes, measured smile, the kind of face people trusted at fundraisers. This morning, in the gray-blue half-light and with Gideon's back door hanging broken on one hinge, he looked like a man who had come early to hear whether the fire took the house. He lifted one hand as he approached the porch. "Gideon, I heard there was trouble. Power outage, maybe a break-in?" Gideon did not answer right away. Rook had moved in front of him, body straight, head level, silent. No bark, no lunge. Just a deliberate block between Gideon and Calder Rowan. Calder's smile thinned at the edges when he noticed the dog's posture, then returned, polished and careful. "Still remembers me," Calder said lightly. Rook did not move, and for the first time since the man stepped from the SUV, Calder stopped looking at Gideon's face and started looking at the cabin windows, as if taking inventory of who had survived the night. Calder Rowan stood on Gideon Vale's porch, like a man arriving early for church. The dawn light was thin and blue over Cedar Hollow, softening the broken doorframe and boarded window behind Gideon in a way that felt almost insulting. Calder's black SUV idled in the drive, clean enough to belong in a city lot instead of a snow-cut road in the north. He held his gloves in one hand and wore concern on his face with the same polished ease he wore money. Gideon did not invite him in. Rook stood between them, yellow-black coat lifted slightly along the shoulders, silent and steady. No bark, no lunge, just a refusal. Calder gave the dog a measured glance, then looked up at Gideon. "I heard there was trouble up here," he said. His voice was warm, controlled, the kind of voice that calmed rooms at fundraisers and made men sign papers they should have read twice. "Road crew called in a transformer issue before dawn. Nolan mentioned a shot was fired near your side of the lake. Thought I'd check on you." Behind Gideon, he could feel movement in the cabin. Nolan shifting near the kitchen wall. Mara staying out of sight on purpose. Juniper's nails on the floorboards. The house had become a lung-holding breath. "You checking on me," Gideon said. "Or checking what survived the night?" Calder smiled faintly, as if indulging a joke from a man who had not slept. Up close, he looked older than the photo on Gideon's table. Mid-50s, broad through the chest and softened at the middle. Silver-brown hair combed back too carefully. Beard trimmed close along a strong jaw that had learned diplomacy before honesty. His eyes were blue-gray, intelligent and tired in the way rich men often looked when they had not done physical labor in years, but still carried the strain of managing other people's secrets. "That's a harsh way to greet a neighbor," Calder said. "You haven't been my neighbor in a while." The words landed. Gideon saw it in the brief stillness around Calder's mouth. Years ago, before Cedar Hollow turned into permits and investors and rumors of development opportunity, Calder had helped Gideon after he left the teams. Not out of charity, out of practical kindness, the kind Gideon respected more. A winter roof repair, a paid consulting job no one called therapy. Space to be quiet when quiet was the only thing keeping him from breaking apart. Gratitude had roots. So did disillusionment. Calder shifted his gaze, trying to look past Gideon into the cabin. Rook stepped half a foot forward. Calder's smile returned, thinner this time. "Still a good dog." "The best kind," Gideon said. "He doesn't care who donates to the church roof." For the first time, something cold moved behind Calder's eyes. It was gone almost instantly. Before either man could speak again, Nolan appeared at Gideon's shoulder, sheriff's jacket zipped to the throat, face pale from fatigue and anger held too tightly. "Mr. Rowan," he said, "this is an active incident area. If you're not here in an official capacity, I need you off the property." Calder looked mildly surprised. "Deputy Pierce, didn't realize you were running tactical out of private residences now. Didn't realize civic investors were doing sunrise welfare checks on gunfire scenes." Nolan's voice shook on the last word, just slightly. Gideon felt an unexpected spark of respect. Young didn't mean weak. It just meant the stakes still had enough edges to cut. Calder put his gloves back on with careful fingers. "Of course, I only came because I care what happens to this community." He turned to leave, then paused and looked toward the boarded window. "Tell your friend inside," he said without looking directly at Gideon, "that hiding doesn't help if the paperwork already moved." Then he walked back down the porch steps and into the blue dawn, polished boots slipping once on packed snow before he recovered and never looked back. The SUV reversed cleanly and disappeared behind the birches. The silence after he left was worse than his voice. Nolan blew out a breath. "That wasn't a welfare check." "No," Gideon said. From inside, Mara spoke for the first time since Calder arrived. "He came to measure the damage." She stood in the hallway wrapped in Gideon's overshirt and a quilted vest Doc Pike had left behind. Her face was pale but set, chestnut hair tied back loosely, eyes fixed on the road where the SUV had vanished. Juniper stood at her leg despite the splinted foreleg, body trembling with effort and fury. The female shepherd's lip had lifted when Calder spoke. Not at his face exactly, but at the scent trail his boots left across the porch. Gideon turned. "He knew you were here?" Mara nodded. "Maybe not for sure before today. For sure now." Nolan ran one hand over his mouth. "We're out of time for local improvising." "I know," Gideon said. "Call your federal contact." "I don't have one." Mara looked between them, then made a decision Gideon could see hurt. "I do." She sat at the table and wrote a name and number on the legal pad in small, controlled print. USEPA Criminal Investigation Division. Nolan whistled softly. "You've been sitting on that?" Mara's jaw tightened. "I didn't know if her office was compromised. I still don't. But Calder's here in person, and that means he's scared enough to stop delegating." Gideon took the number and handed Nolan the satellite phone. "Use the upstairs room. Window gets better signal. Keep it short. Facts only." While Nolan climbed the stairs, Gideon moved to the workbench where the blue box contents sat repacked in dry layers. The ledger, the drive, the sample jar. Proof had weight. He had forgotten that after war. In war, proof was often noise and smoke and who was left standing. Here, proof could still be pages and signatures and a jar of poisoned mud. It felt almost holy and almost fragile. Mara watched him as if she knew where his mind had gone. "He helped you once," she said quietly. Gideon didn't answer. "You don't owe me the truth about your past," she continued. "But if Calder was good to you when you needed it, I understand why this is hard." Gideon's hands were still on the edge of the bench. "Hard isn't the problem." "What is?" He looked at the ledger. "How many times a man can be both things?" Mara said nothing to that. The kindest thing in the room was her silence. By midday, the sky had thickened into low gray cloud, and the temperature dropped again. Nolan came downstairs with a face that looked like he'd aged 3 years since dawn. "She's coming," he said. "Monroe. 2 agents with her. Unmarked vehicle. She told me not to route anything through county dispatch." "Good," Gideon said. "Also bad," Nolan replied. "Because if she said that out loud, she already thinks someone local is dirty." Mara's shoulders stiffened, but she nodded as if hearing a diagnosis she expected. They spent the next hour preparing to move. Not run, move. Gideon chose the old service path to the creek because the main spur would be easier to watch. Nolan packed evidence bags, markers, and a camera. Mara drew a rough sketch of the creek mouth and buried drum locations she suspected based on slope and runoff. Juniper barked once when she saw the map and tapped one point with her nose, then another. "She remembers the scent spread," Mara said, voice soft with pride and grief both. "The pattern, not just the spot." Rook stood beside Juniper and watched her work with his usual stern attention, as if reviewing a trainee he respected. When they loaded gear by the porch, Mara stumbled. It was small, just a moment. Her knees loosened, the world tilting under a body that still had not fully returned from cold and adrenaline. Gideon was nearest and caught her by the forearm before she hit the steps. She froze at his touch, not pulling away, not leaning in, just still. For one strange, suspended second, the wind dropped and the dogs went quiet. Rook and Juniper both looked at them, not alarmed, not defensive, simply watching, as if measuring whether 2 damaged people could stand in the same weight without one collapsing. Mara's eyes lifted to Gideon's. "I hate being the reason the room changes," she said, barely above a whisper. Gideon loosened his grip but didn't let go until she found her balance. "Then stop thinking of yourself as the reason," he said. "Think of yourself as the witness." Something in her expression shifted, not healed, not even lighter, but steadier. Behind them, Juniper huffed once and sat. Rook turned toward the road again, as if the moment had been noted and filed, and the world could resume. The unmarked federal SUV arrived just past 1. Lydia Monroe stepped out first. She was in her early 40s, medium height, compact and strong in the way of someone who had spent more time in field boots than conference rooms. Her skin was deep brown and wind-dry at the cheeks, her black hair pulled into a tight, low bun beneath a knit cap, and her eyes were dark, level, and unsentimental. She wore a plain, charcoal winter shell over tactical layers. No jewelry except a wedding band dulled by scratches. Her face carried the calm of people who had seen institutional corruption often enough to stop being surprised by it. The cost of that calm showed in the lines at the corners of her mouth. 2 agents came with her. Both quiet, both efficient, neither trying to own the room. Monroe took in the broken door, the boarded window, the dogs, Mara's bruised wrists, and the evidence bench in one sweep. "Miss Ellison," she said. Mara gave a short, humorless laugh. "Not today." Monroe nodded once. "Good. We don't have time for bad names." Gideon liked her immediately, which made him suspicious of himself. They worked fast. Monroe documented the blue box and contents, took custody photographs, and had Nolan witness each transfer. She bagged the sample jar with temporary field labeling and noted temperature, location, and condition. The hard drive went into a Faraday pouch. The ledger was wrapped and sealed after she photographed every visible page edge. "Chain starts here," she said. "If anyone asks, this evidence came from a private citizen recovery before local notification due to credible threat and attempted homicide indicators. Because that is what happened." Nolan looked almost relieved to hear someone say it cleanly. Then they moved to the creek. The site felt different with a federal team on it, less like a secret, more like a reckoning. Monroe's agents set markers and photographed tire tracks, tarp fragments, and soil disruption. Mara, still weak but sharp, guided them to the runoff line and pointed out unnatural grading where snow alone could not explain the contour. Juniper limped carefully at her side, nose working in short bursts. Rook ranged 10 yards out, then circled back, scanning the tree line. At the bank, Monroe crouched and lifted a gloved finger to the air. "Deodorizer," she said. "Cheap industrial masking, used to throw off canine alerts." Mara nodded. Junie cut through it anyway. Monroe looked at the dog with a brief, genuine respect. Good dog. Juniper's ears flicked. They found the first buried drum under frozen mud and compact snow where Mara predicted. Then another. Both dented, marked with transport codes half burned off. Monroe photographed, tagged, and radioed coordinates to her team in clipped code. The afternoon was closing in when a truck engine sounded above the creek. Everyone looked up. Calder Rowan stood on the bank beside a county utility truck he had no business driving. No overcoat this time. Wool cap, heavy work jacket, gloves, boots muddied to the ankle. He had dressed for terrain, which told Gideon more than any speech could. "What is this?" Calder called down, voice carrying over the ice. "Federal agents on private easement land without notice?" Monroe straightened slowly. "Special Agent Lydia Monroe, EPA-CID. Step back from the edge and identify yourself." Calder spread his hands as if insulted by the question. Calder Rowan. This property is under active investment review. If someone fed you bad intel, we can straighten that out inside. No, Monroe said. We'll straighten it out here. Calder's gaze flicked to Mara, then to the evidence bags, then to Gideon. The friendly mask slipped a fraction. This is about her, he said. You don't even know what she stole. Mara stepped forward before Gideon could stop her. I stole nothing. Calder laughed once, sharp and joyless. You took records from men who own this county. Monroe's tone did not change. That sentence is being recorded. Calder turned on her, anger finally burning through polish. You think this is dumping? This is infrastructure, temporary storage, seasonal management. Do you know how many jobs vanish if these permits freeze? Gideon heard the old persuasion in it. The way Calder could take greed and dress it as community sacrifice. It had worked on boards, donors, probably judges. It did not work here. Juniper suddenly growled, not at Calder's face, at his voice. Her body went rigid, ears forward, eyes locked, a low shaking sound in her chest that rolled into a bark so abrupt everyone flinched. Mara looked at the dog, then at Calder, and all the blood seemed to leave her face. It was you, she said. Calder's expression changed, one beat too slow. Mara's voice broke and hardened in the same breath. You were there, at the pit. You didn't touch me, but you stood above me and told them to hurry. Calder went still. Then quietly, with no smile left, he said to Gideon, I didn't kill her. I let Winter do what Winter does. The words hit Gideon like a fist to an old bruise. A buried slope, a different country, a different Winter. A body he had reached too late because one order came 2 minutes late and one road closed too fast. Memory moved through him with the cold precision of steel. Rook stepped in front of him, just enough to break the line. Not command, contact. Gideon drew a breath he had almost forgotten to take. Monroe moved first. Calder Rowan, step away from the bank and place your hands where I can see them. Calder's eyes flicked once toward the utility truck, measuring distance. Nolan raised his weapon. Don't. Monroe's agents closed angle from both sides. Calder looked at Gideon one last time, and for a heartbeat Gideon saw the man from years ago, the one on the dock, offering work and silence to a soldier who needed both. Then it was gone, buried under calculation and fear. He lifted his hands. Monroe cuffed him herself. As she turned him toward the truck, Calder leaned just enough to look past her at Mara. His voice was low, almost conversational. You were never the first target. Mara stared at him, breath caught high and thin. Monroe shoved Calder forward before he could say more. The creek moved under ice. Wind dragged snow across the bank. Juniper stood trembling at Mara's leg, growl fading into a strained whine, while Rook remained at Gideon's side, steady as a post driven into frozen ground. Gideon looked at Mara and saw the new fear settling in, the kind that came not from what had happened, but from what the truth had just opened. The evidence bags snapped in the wind as Monroe's team carried them uphill. The day had begun with a man on the porch wearing concern like a coat. It ended with him in cuffs beside a poisoned creek, and the worst sentence of the day was not his arrest. It was the one he left behind. By the time the first thaw came to Cedar Hollow, the lake did not melt all at once. It changed in sounds first. Small ones. A long crack somewhere far from shore at dawn. A low shifting groan under the wind by noon. The soft dripping from the eaves in late afternoon that made a person stop in the doorway and listen, as if the house itself had started breathing differently. Gideon Vale noticed all of it. He noticed because he had trained himself to notice what changed before it became danger. He also noticed because for the first time in a long while, he was no longer the only one listening. Mara stood at the kitchen window with a mug in both hands, watching the lake through the old glass while Juniper slept on a folded blanket near the stove. The dog was healing, but slowly, the kind of healing that looked invisible to impatient people and miraculous to anyone who had seen the injury up close. Her splinted foreleg was gone now, replaced by a soft brace and careful limits she hated. She was leaner than before, scar hidden beneath regrown fur, still quick to react, still quicker to place herself between Mara and any unexpected movement. Rook lay on the porch, just outside the open door, yellow-black coat bright in the afternoon sun, head up, eyes half-narrowed against the light. He had taken it upon himself to guard the threshold as if winter itself might file an appeal. Inside the cabin, the radio was on. Low. Static came and went with the signal, and every time it crackled, Mara's shoulders tightened before she reminded them not to. In the early weeks after the arrest, she could not bear the sound at all. Now she let it play while she worked. Some days she turned the volume down. Some days she did not touch it. Either way, she no longer shut it off in a panic. That counted as progress in this house. Gideon was at the porch rail, replacing a warped board the intruders had split during the attack. He worked in old gloves with a hammer and pry bar, moving with the same economy he used in everything else. Tall, clean-shaven, wind-browned skin, jaw set when he concentrated. His faded olive-gray combat shirt was rolled at the sleeves, forearms corded but not showy, old military watch catching light when he lifted the hammer. He looked like a man built for leaving quickly and staying longer than he intended. Mara glanced toward him through the window. "Your measurement is off," she said. Without looking up, Gideon replied, "It isn't. You cut for the old frame. The wood swelled." He paused, checked the line, and exhaled once through his nose. "You could have told me before I nailed one side." Mara's mouth curved. "I did. You ignored me with confidence." From the porch, Rook opened one eye, as if acknowledging that this was now a recurring pattern and not a crisis. There were no sirens anymore. That was the strange part. After Calder Rowan's arrest, there had been days of motion, federal, vehicles, sealed roads, men in boots speaking into radios, county staff pretending not to recognize names they had signed forms beside. Then came paperwork, interviews, temporary injunctions, property locks, public statements worded carefully enough to offend everyone equally. The violence had been sharp. The aftermath was fluorescent. Mara knew that world too well. She sat at Gideon's table each morning and reviewed copies of statements with Special Agent Lydia Monroe by phone or encrypted email when the signal held. Lydia had become a steady presence in practical doses. Clear instructions, dry humor, no false comfort. She moved through corruption like a woman who had seen too much of it to ever romanticize justice, but still believed in building a case strong enough to survive the people who wanted it buried. Calder had not been the top. He had been what Mara called a hinge. The real target, they learned, had been a state-level compliance analyst named Evan Mercer, a man in his early 40s with a narrow face, thinning blonde hair, and the permanent stoop of someone who had spent years over files and monitors instead of in sunlight. He was not brave in the heroic sense. He had no speeches in him, no instinct for confrontation. But he had noticed transfers that did not match disposal logs, approvals issued before inspections, and permit changes routed through private consultants who billed like engineers and moved money like smugglers. He copied what he found. Then he disappeared before he could deliver it. Mara had been his outside handoff, not the center, not the architect, the courier with enough field knowledge to know where the records mattered, and enough bad luck to be found before she could move them cleanly. The sentence Calder left behind at the creek had opened that truth like a knife. You were never the first target. For a week after that, Mara woke before dawn with the same thought. Then where is he? Some mornings she asked it aloud. Some mornings she did not. Today she was trying not to. A truck pulled into the drive just after 3, engine coughing once before settling. Not federal, not local utility. Doc Pike's old truck announced itself like a stubborn hymn. Harlan Pike climbed out carrying a crate of groceries in one arm and a coil of wire in the other. 70 years old, broad and weathered, white beard clipped close. He moved slower than he once had, but with the same blunt competence. He had the expression of a man perpetually disappointed in modern packaging and mildly offended by unnecessary suffering. "I brought decent food," he called from the drive. "And fence wire, since your porch still looks like a crime scene from certain angles." "It was a crime scene," Mara said. Pike squinted toward the porch. "I know. I'm trying to improve morale." Juniper woke and hobbled to the door, tail giving one restrained sweep. Pike crouched with a grunt and scratched behind her ears. "How's the princess of poor decisions?" Juniper leaned into his hand, then glanced back at Mara before relaxing fully. Permission requested. Permission granted. Pike noticed everything. He always had. He carried the crate inside and set it down on the counter. "Town meeting tonight," he said without preamble. "Church Hall. Half the county wants Rowan called a villain. The other half wants him called misunderstood. A few still want their investment projections back." Gideon pulled the miscut porch board free and tossed it aside. "You going?" Pike snorted. "At my age, I attend things only if I can improve them or ruin them. Tonight may be both." Mara looked up from her papers. "Are people angry at the victims?" "Some." Pike opened the crate and started unpacking onions, potatoes, canned tomatoes. "People get mean when truth costs them money. Others are bringing casseroles to families they ignored for years. Cedar Hollow is having a personality event." Mara stared at the table for a moment, jaw tight. Pike's voice softened just enough to be heard, not pitied. "You did not break this town, girl. You interrupted a lie. That's messier but cleaner in the long run." Mara blinked hard and looked away. "I know." Knowing and believing are cousins. They visit at different times. Gideon glanced toward Pike then. It was a simple sentence, but it landed in the room and stayed there. That evening, after Pike left and the light thinned toward gold, Mara went to hang washed dish towels near the stove and froze halfway across the room. Not from fear, from memory. Her gaze had fixed on the refrigerator door, where Gideon had, weeks earlier, pinned a copy of the evidence transfer receipt under a magnet and forgotten to move it. Beneath it, tucked crookedly into the frame, was a plain white card Lydia had forwarded that afternoon. 4 words, printed from an evidence interview summary. Mercer left a note. Mara did not move for several seconds. Gideon noticed the stillness before he saw the card. "What?" Her voice came out thin. "They found something in Mercer's apartment, in a vent." She stepped closer, reading as if the words might vanish if she blinked too long. Lydia's typed summary below the line was brief, clinical, but one sentence struck like a bell. "If anything happens, trust the woman with the dog." Mara pressed the dish towel to her mouth. Juniper stood and came to her at once, leaning hard into her leg. Rook appeared in the doorway without sound, watching from the threshold. For a moment, the cabin held no case files, no charges, no permits, no names, only one tired woman standing in a kitchen with proof that someone she thought she had failed had chosen to trust her to the end. When Mara finally lowered the towel, her eyes were wet but steady. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew he was already being hunted." Gideon looked at the card, then at her, and he still moved the records. Mara nodded. "Not because he thought he'd survive, because he thought maybe I would." The radio crackled on the counter, and this time she did not flinch. She reached over and turned it up one notch. The indictments came in waves. Rowan first, on expanded federal and state counts. Conspiracy, falsification of environmental compliance records, obstruction, attempted homicide participation, and financial crimes tied to Shell logistics contracts. Then the contractor network names followed. Subcontractors, transport coordinators, 2 permit consultants, and 1 county official who resigned before dawn and denied everything by noon. People in town took sides in familiar ways. Some said Calder had built jobs and docks and tax base and should not be thrown away over technical violations. Some said they had always known something was wrong but had not wanted to know badly enough to lose comfort. Some cried in the grocery aisle when they learned why the creek behind their property no longer froze clean. Elsie Rowe, naturally, had no patience for gradual moral awakening. She posted a handwritten sign in her shop window. Nolan read it aloud over coffee one morning and laughed so hard he nearly choked. He looked different now. Tired, yes, but steadier. The kind of steadiness that came after a person made one hard choice and survived it. He still had to explain the discharge of his service weapon from the night of the attack, and Lydia's office helped formalize the incident report with the attempted break-in evidence. It did not erase the paperwork. It made it survivable. As for Evan Mercer, they found him alive. 3 counties south, under a false name, in a budget motel paid in cash through a church outreach fund Calder's people never thought to check. He was thinner than in his employee badge photo and shook when he spoke too fast, but he was alive. Mara met him only once during the first secure interview. She came back from that meeting quiet and sat on Gideon's porch for almost an hour with Juniper's head in her lap and Rook standing guard nearby. Neither dog asking for anything except proximity. She did not tell Gideon everything Mercer said. She did tell him this. He apologized for making me carry it. Gideon sanded the new porch board smooth and kept his eyes on the wood. And what did you say? Mara watched the lake where dark lines of water now split the ice farther from shore. I told him to stay alive long enough to testify and apologize later if he still needed to. That sounds like you. It sounded better in my head. Days lengthened. Juniper's gait improved, though she still favored the leg after too much activity. Rook maintained his post at the porch, like a retired sergeant who had not accepted retirement paperwork. Mara worked mornings on statements, afternoons on quiet things, laundry, inventorying pantry shelves, cleaning windows, rehanging curtains that had been taken down after the break-in. Gideon split wood he no longer strictly needed and fixed things that had not bothered him for years until someone else started seeing them. The first evening she rehung the curtains. They were uneven. Gideon noticed and said nothing. Mara noticed him noticing and narrowed her eyes. If you measure those after I sit down, I'll move out on principle. You'd make it to the porch, he said. Rude. Accurate. She smiled anyway. No one said the word stay for a long time. That was part of why it mattered when she finally did. It happened on a clear afternoon when the lake gave up its first wide sheet of open water near shore and reflected the sky so brightly they both had to squint. Gideon was replacing the final cracked board by the steps. Mara was at the window, one hand on the new curtain hem, testing how it fell in the light. Juniper slept by the stove. Rook lay outside with one paw over the threshold, guarding both worlds at once. Mara looked out at the water, then at Gideon. "I'm going to stay a little longer," she said. No ceremony, no grand speech, just a truth set gently in the room. Gideon tapped the nail flat, set down the hammer, and looked past her through the glass to the lake breaking apart under spring. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Stay." He did not ask how long. She did not explain. Outside, a piece of shoreline ice broke free and drifted into open water with a soft, almost delicate sound. Rook lifted his head, watched it go, then settled again. Juniper, half asleep, thumped her tail once against the floorboards. The radio murmured on the counter. The cabin, which had once been a place Gideon used to disappear, held 4 steady heartbeats and the ordinary noises of a life being repaired one board, one breath, one honest decision at a time. And for now, that was enough. Sometimes, we think miracles only come in dramatic ways, like thunder, lightning, or a sudden voice from heaven. But this story reminds us that many miracles arrive quietly. Sometimes a miracle looks like a dog who refuses to stop searching. Sometimes it looks like a man who chooses to help when it would be easier to walk away. Sometimes it looks like a wounded person who still finds the courage to tell the truth. And sometimes it looks like justice moving slowly, but still moving. What happened at Cedar Hollow was not just about survival. It was about faithfulness, courage, and the kind of truth that refuses to stay buried. Evil tried to hide under snow, money, and fear. But God often works through ordinary people who choose to do the next right thing. One step, one warning, one act of kindness at a time. That is the lesson for all of us. In everyday life, we may not face frozen lakes or dangerous men, but we all face moments when we are asked to choose. Will we stay silent when something feels wrong? Will we help someone who is hurting? Will we keep showing up when healing takes longer than we expected? Will we trust that God is still working, even when the answer is slow? This story also reminds us that loyalty is a gift from God. The love of a faithful dog, the courage of a wounded heart, the strength of a helping hand. These are not small things. They are signs of grace. They are reminders that God can use anyone and anything to protect, guide, and restore life. If this story touched your heart, let it change something in your day today. Check on someone. Speak the truth gently but bravely. Pay attention when your spirit tells you something is not right. And if you are in a hard season, do not give up. The ice does break. The light does return. If this message encouraged you, please share this video with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share a moment when God protected you in an unexpected way. And subscribe to the channel so more stories of courage, faith, and quiet miracles can reach the people who need them most. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, heal what is hurting, and guide your steps with peace. May His mercy go before you, and may His presence stay with you in every season. You are not alone. And with God, even what was meant for harm can become the beginning of healing.